Welcome everyone to the Matrix Conversations and Transformations, a webinar series from the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice. I'm Professor Mary Christianakis, and I'm joined by my co-organizers of the series, Professor Heldman, the chair of the department, and Professor Malik Muazzam Dolat. Professor Mora and Professor Kai Small are co-hosting with us today. First, a bit about the series. The series focuses on pressing current events and seeks to connect our community with experts, scholars, artists, and the most effective activists. This fall, in collaboration with the California Immigration Semester, we are hosting a series that focused on immigration. You can register for the upcoming events and access our YouTube channel where you can watch a video of past events at oxy.edu/matrix. We're also on Instagram and Twitter at CTSJ Oxy for both. Next Wednesday, just a heads up, October 14th, 9:45 a.m., which is different from our regular time, Martha Gonzalez and Quetzal Flores will be talking about their artistic endeavors in the California Immigration Semester series. Please join us. Professor Mora of the Sociology Department will introduce our wonderful guest for today's webinar.
Hello, everyone. Stephanie L. Canizales, Assistant Professor of Sociology, University of California at Merced, specializes in migration and immigration integration, children and youth, inequality and mobility, and race and ethnicity. Her first book project, entitled Sin Padres ni Papeles, systematically examines why undocumented, unaccompanied Central American and Mexican youth migrate to Los Angeles, California, and how they integrate into school, work, family, and community life as they come of age without parents and papers. In a second project, Professor Canizales is investigating the social, economic, and health effects of unaccompanied migration, asylum law, and application procedures, and social integration in the US on asylum-seeking minors, their caregivers, and their communities in Los Angeles County, California, and Harris County, Texas. Her research has been published in Ethnic and Racial Studies and the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. She has also co-authored works on Latinx entrepreneurship, undocumented families, and the unintended consequences of asylum procedures. So now we'll hear from Professor Canizales.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm sharing my screen. Okay, Richard, we can see that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. In my mind, there's millions of people watching, and I'm a star right now. So thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Stephanie Canizales. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at UC Merced. I'm really excited to have been invited to this incredible series and for the opportunity to share my book in progress with you. As Richard mentioned, I broadly characterize myself as a scholar of international migration, immigrant integration, inequality, poverty, and mobility, but I especially focus on the lives of Latin American origin children and families in the US. I have done this work since about 2009, studying specifically the unaccompanied, undocumented social incorporation journeys of Central American and Mexican origin youth growing up in Los Angeles. A lot of our understanding of undocumented youth incorporation is largely shaped by research, very recent research like that of Roberto Gonzalez's study Lives in Limbo that tells this longitudinal story of undocumented youth transitions into adulthood through primarily educational institutions, schools, and the coming of age and coming into illegality experience that we have become very familiar with over the past few decades. Alongside this work, there's now a growing body of research on unaccompanied Central American minors in the US, like Susan Terio's work, Whose Child Am I?, that follows the experiences of children in US federal custody and how they move through institutions of federal immigration custody and into their sponsors' homes. We also had a recent book published earlier this year by Lauren Heidbrink that tells the story of the deportation of children that are formally detected, processed, and then returned to their home countries and their experiences of resettling in their home countries, especially focused on the case of Guatemalan indigenous youth. So where my work comes in is sort of an intervention into what I consider as a binary portrait of undocumented youth in the US today. On the one hand, we have a body of work that examines youth brought to the US at young ages who grow up fully immersed in American society and indistinguishable from their peers. These youth are described as having to learn to be illegal, transitioning into illegality as they transition into adulthood, realizing that they're blocked from full membership in US society and also the markers of success, rites of passage that the peers that they once felt indistinguishable from are moving through. And then in 2014, the humanitarian crisis of Central American migration and unaccompanied minor migration specifically drew our attention to the growing number of children that are being displaced from countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras by extreme violence and poverty. These undocumented minor migrants arrived in the US characterized primarily in search of family members that had migrated before them and are largely framed as a new US immigration stream, but also a global immigration stream. This framing really ignores a third segment of the undocumented youth population whose experiences don't really fit into the long settled, high achieving, deserving youth frame or the newly arrived deviant minor frame. And these are immigrant youth that I study who knowingly journey to the US as undocumented minors who come of age not only without legal protection, but without their parents, hence Sin Padres ni Papeles. I refer to these immigrants as undocumented, unaccompanied youth. Upon arrival in the US, these unaccompanied undocumented youth anticipate financial independence. They may enter into exploitative low-wage labor like that in factories, restaurants, warehouses, some domestic work as well, these jobs that are typically considered immigrant jobs. And like many undocumented adult laborers, they initially have the hope of returning to their home countries. They find over time, though, that the structure of the labor market, low wages, their undocumented status, and the political and economic uncertainties of the countries that they left actually keeps them in the US much longer than they intended. So I draw on observation and interview-based data I collected across 4 years from 2012 to 2016 to understand how Central American and Mexican young adults who grew up knowing of their undocumented status, who grew up navigating life without parents, how they experience incorporation in the US, and how being financially independent specifically uniquely shapes the coming of age trajectories, right? So we're not talking about youth, undocumented youth coming of age in schools and transitioning into adulthood as students, but really as workers.
Professor Canizales,
Yes.
your slideshows, are you meaning to start your slideshow? Because we're still on the initial page.
It says that my screen is being shared.
It is shared, but the slideshow is still on the initials.
Are we caught up?
Okay, now we can see it.
Okay, my apologies. Okay, so my study of work primacy among unaccompanied undocumented youth is a part of a larger study, Sin Padres ni Papeles, and I was asked to talk about the book broadly, but just want to focus on work primacy today. So I'm just going to walk through the chapters of my book to kind of lead us up to this discussion of work primacy. So I open really with the story of the motives for migration, the individual, family, and community-based reasons why youth leave their homes and their home countries. I really work to root this entire book project in this idea of youth agency and children's agency in their coming of age experiences, countering this notion that children are dependent on adults up until they reach the age of 18, but that at young ages, youth can exert decision-making power and exert independent thinking and contributions to the household at very young ages. In the next chapter, in chapter 2, I draw on the experiences of long settled youth to talk about their initial settlement experiences, particularly how youth establish social networks and social ties with family members or community members in the absence of parents, right? Because a lot of the literature really talks about the role of parents in situating immigrant youth within their community or family context in the host society. So in this, I think about how youth relate to maybe tíos, tías, primos that are already living in the US and how they develop community ties over time. Something that's really interesting here is that while we think of unaccompanied youth as perhaps being sympathetically received in the host country by long settled relatives, what we actually can find is that in some cases, the long settled relatives are unwilling or unable to take a young person in. So an unaccompanied minor has to really fend for themselves in the first few years that they're in the US. I move then into chapter 3, which is my discussion of work primacy. I get into the conditions of work, what makes work a central organizing institution, and shaping the experiences of youth social incorporation as they come of age. And then I'll get into this later, so I won't delve too much into that now, but I then move into a discussion of indigenous youth. I have about 30 of my 75 participants, interview participants, were indigenous Mayan youth. So I talk about how ethno-racial identity and the disparagement of indigeneity within the Latino culture can also come to fragment social ties and disrupt youth's ability to access supportive networks, jobs, educational opportunities, and so forth. I also talk about indigeneity as a tool for developing community embeddedness once youth start to attach themselves more to the cultural capital, the ethnic pride that they feel in being indigenous Mayan in Los Angeles. And then I end with a discussion of what all of these unique experiences and social positions tell us about how youth understand mobility in the US. If they aren't college graduates, if they aren't politically active, if they aren't documented or dreamer ascribing youth, how do you define mobility? How do you define success? And that's something I'll get into at the very end of my talk also. Okay, so I have about 30 minutes left, so I'm going to jump into chapter 3 and what I mean when I say work primacy. But first, some relevant research to kind of get us caught up. Studies of Latin American labor migration in the US, which have largely focused on the case of adult workers and builds on the case of Mexican labor migrants specifically, demonstrates that labor migration is a strategy used to overcome labor market restructuring and instability in their home countries. People move, labor migrants pursue labor migration to recoup economic opportunities that were lost during these periods of restructuring and instability. So immigration scholars agree that immigrant incorporation outcomes differ among different groups based on the reason for their migration, the age and life stage at arrival, their national origin, gender, how much capital or their socioeconomic status upon arrival in their home country, among other characteristics, right? People don't have, all newcomers don't have the same linear social incorporation pathway. Importantly, recent research that compares undocumented adults with undocumented youth finds that institutional context also matters. But because we think of adults as workers and youth as students, we haven't really thought of youth in the workplace and how that shapes their social incorporation experiences. Typically, it's the adult parent who navigates US institutions. If there's a fragmented family or transnational family as a result of labor migration. It's typically the adult parent that migrates, leaving left behind children. This is a unique case where children are migrating to support adult parents and younger siblings, right? When children migrate, typically there's a focus on children's experiences in their home, in their family, or their movement through educational institutions, how youth develop co-ethnic ties within community-based organizations. We don't typically think of youth in the workplace. There are recent studies, like the recent book by Amira Estrada, that focuses on the work kids do. But again, we think of children's work as supplemental to that of adults, supporting the household economy that is typically upheld by the adult caretaker. Children can work for spending money. They also do work like language brokering, translating for their families, legal brokering, like translating documents or talking to lawyers, that sort of thing. But this idea of an entirely financially independent youth or young person is left out of a lot of our discussion of immigrant incorporation. That's my cat, sorry about that. So many unaccompanied youth migrate to global cities like Los Angeles to work in manufacturing, service occupations. And this really puts on its head this idea that adults are the labor migrants, right? We have seen children and youth migrating to the US for several decades, sometimes without their parents. And the work that I do is really drawing attention to that as a central experience. Existing research inadequately accounts for the vulnerability of this segment of the undocumented youth population. And I really want to draw attention to how youth independently navigate US society and US institutions when they are the ones supporting themselves and their families abroad. So to theorize undocumented immigrant youth's family dynamic and institutional context as shaping their social incorporation in young adulthood, I conceptualize youth as agentic economic actors and labor migrants who act on their personal and familial best interest. Labor migration has been described as being motivated by individualism and self-responsibility, but also being motivated by family loyalty, community collectivism, and concern for a broader collective of people, right? Youth, individual, and family obligations and the urgency of financial need, I argue, not only prompts their labor migration, but then creates the conditions by which they're relegated into the low-wage labor market, the secondary labor market in the US. And these forces shape unaccompanied, undocumented youth social incorporation as they navigate financial pressures for their own survival in the US, the survival of their families left behind, but also operating within the constraints, the structural constraints of the secondary labor market, including exploitative wages, long hours, unstable occupations, and so forth. So the outcomes of these two pressures is what I term work primacy, the centrality of work in the economic and non-economic lives of undocumented immigrant youth who are growing up employed in the secondary labor market. I argue that work primacy shapes social incorporation, obviously in the workplace because they are workers, but outside of the workplace in education, family life, and in community life. And while we have long talked about incorporation as an endpoint, asking whether groups are incorporated or not, right? We think of incorporation as achieved or an endpoint. I think about it more as a process, something that we are constantly doing and working towards, immigrant or not, and therefore it's something that we can observe through patterns of embeddedness, through ongoing socioeconomic mobility among immigrants and their descendants through major social institutions. And I focus on school, family, and community life because these are the major vital spheres of social life that immigration scholars have identified as really contributing to someone's ability to incorporate long-term in the US or in any host society. So bringing us up to speed to my research, I'm drawing here on data I collected in Pico Union and Westlake MacArthur Park areas of Los Angeles, just a few miles west of downtown LA. This is a primary site of initial arrival for Central Americans today, has long been a traditional destination for Mexicans in Los Angeles. Also, I collected my data between 2012 and 2016, so 2 years before the humanitarian crisis and 2 years after, and just before the rise of our current president. So I have about 75 semi-structured interviews. 68 of my interview participants were full-time workers at the time of our interview. A majority were from Central American countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. 11 of my participants were Mexican origin. I had a median interviewee age of 23, so I was only able to get access to, for human ethics concerns, people over the age of 18, but most of the participants were in their early 20s, had been in the US for just over 3 years on average. Their age of migration ranged from 9 years old to 17 years old, and the median age of migration was 16 years old. Of the 68 full-time workers, a majority of the workers concentrated in the garment industry, also restaurant work, domestic and janitorial work. The other category was 1 or 2 people who maybe worked at car washes and construction and other day laborers, other jobs that we know of as immigrant jobs. So people often ask me, how is it that a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old can get a job in Los Angeles? So I present these pictures as evidence of how easy it is to actually find work, primarily in the garment industry, where a lot of my participants worked. You can walk around Pico Union, Westlake, downtown LA, and see signs posted outside of what look like often abandoned buildings or restaurants. And people can walk in, go up to, here it says, looking for an overlock worker on the 6th floor. Just take the elevator to the 6th floor, and there you'll find a manager, a business owner who decides if someone can start working, when they start working. And I often heard workers talk about how the buildings look abandoned, and you don't really know if someone is actually still hiring, and there are tactics taken to make the buildings themselves look that way, right? Locking the doors, closing the windows, not letting natural light come in, so that when inspectors come around, they're not detectable. Restaurant workers, car washers, other workers in open spaces talked about how when inspectors would come around, they'd be sent out the back door or sent off the property, and either told to come later or on another day when the inspection had cleared. So it's not actually that hard for a young person to find work. Unaccompanied immigrant youth pursue employment, as I mentioned, as a matter of familial and individual survival. Along with needing housing, food, clothing, and in some cases medical attention, youth arrive in the US with between $3,000 and $11,000 of debt. And again, this was data I collected between 2012 and 2016. So we can imagine today or just the years post the humanitarian crisis that these prices actually went up, and that they accumulate interest with every day that they go unpaid. So the economic demands for survival are paired with promises that youth made to left behind families to remit money for their expenses as well. One participant said, "I came here with one goal, to take care of my mom so that she suffers less." And this statement was also made often in reference to grandparents, aunts, uncles, younger siblings, and other family members, showing again that youth have agency, youth have concern, and are often caretakers and financial contributors in their homes. Youth's personal obligations are met by wages earned in the secondary labor market, which can be anywhere between for my participants, $60 a week to $400 a week. These wages are spread thin in Los Angeles, which ranks 11th in estimates for the most expensive metropolitan areas in the US. So Los Angeles is 17% more expensive than the national average in terms of standard of living. As minors, workers would appear in front of their employers responding to calls like those signs that in the photos that I showed. And employers would ask them, ¿Tienes experiencia? Do you have experience? One participant recalled this interaction with his first employer and said that at 15 years old, he responded, Sí, tengo experiencia. He had sewn t-shirts in his hometown in Guatemala. He said, I have experience. And the employer said, but you're a child still. We could be sued if we hire you. You can basically go to school. And he said, I thought, yes, I would like to go to school, but no one is going to financially support me. It's just me. Who else? It's me by myself. Along these lines, Andres, who's a 26-year-old garment worker, arrived in Los Angeles at 15 years old. He said, no one wanted to help me, but I needed it. I needed to find a job to survive, to pay the rent, the food, to take care of myself. The pressure to work is then compounded when youth encounter the unevenness of their income and that standard of living in Los Angeles, right? Something I heard quite often was youth saying, yo pensaba que aquí se venía a recoger dinero. I really thought you came here and just picked up money off the streets, that there were abundant opportunities for mobility, for savings, and to achieve their goals, right? They continue to say, I didn't think work would be this hard either, but that's how it is. And then I saw you pay for light, gas, everything. Pagas todo. You pay for everything here. So youth from agrarian backgrounds or more impoverished backgrounds are surprised to find that you're paying for food, water, lights, public transportation, laundry, things that sort of accumulate and then start to drain your meager earnings, right? They thought then that they would have money to save or to remit, but it was actually spent before they even earned it. And again, thinking these people have thousands of dollars of debt that they're still paying off. So another mechanism contributing to the primacy of work in everyday life is the instability, exploitation, and illness and injury experienced in the secondary labor market. I talked about the locked doors, the dim lights. There's also cases where people said that they wouldn't take their lunch breaks or they wouldn't take breaks throughout the day. Repetitive physical movement, washing cars, sewing denim, sewing t-shirts, cleaning homes, those sorts of things that wear and tear on the body, right? People either spend hours a day sitting, not being able to stand up and walk around, or hours a day standing, not able to take a break. And then on top of that, dealing with the instability of earnings, the unpredictability of how much you would make that day or that week. I often heard the phrase, se baja el trabajo, the availability of work declines at different times throughout the year. So youth couldn't even predict their savings a few months from the day that they were working or by the end of the year. So given all of these experiences in the workplace and related to income, earnings, savings, remittances, I really started to think about, okay, well, what does that do then to their ability to function outside of work? And that's where work primacy gets particularly interesting, because I found that it affects how youth participate in school, community, and family life. In regards to education and language learning, youth negotiated their educational trajectories within the context of work and in light of their social role as workers. So they didn't think of themselves primarily as students who work to supplement their life. It was workers who think of schooling as whether or not it would actually help their economic mobility. Some transitioned into young adulthood having never enrolled in school because of the lack of guidance or deterrence by employers, which we see here in the first quote. A supermarket employer asked a 15-year-old Salvadoran, why would you want to go to school? He said, I'll put you on the register and you can learn to speak to customers. You'll learn English here and there and you'll make some money. with the allure of earning more money to support his mom and younger brother that remained in El Salvador. This young man was deterred from ever enrolling in school and didn't actually, I had interviewed him, I think at 20, he was 26 when I interviewed him and still didn't really speak English. Others didn't enroll in school because of financial need, not being able to afford the cost of schooling or night school. So we're talking about people who work 9 to 5 or actually 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. And then go to school 7:45 to 9:45. And these night classes also accumulate costs, right? Tomas, who arrived in Los Angeles at the age of 14, describes when I interviewed him at the age of 20 that he saw attending English language school as impossible because, as he put it, no one helped me. I had to pay rent, I had to pay food, so I either go to school and I didn't have money for rent or food, or I don't go to school and I have money for rent and to eat. So the decision is really between mobility and long-term mobility and immediate survival, right? And youth will always choose their immediate survival. Being that they're unaccompanied and financially independent, Tomas's case shows that there's actually a risk to enrolling in school. And when enrollment is achieved, youth workers experience the classroom based on how they experience the workday. So one respondent said that you spend 12 hours at work, another 2 hours sitting in class, aside from the 12 hours you already spent, right? If you count that time that people start to work at 6, 7, 8, 9 a.m., another 3 hours in school, you end up spending double digits of hours sitting, right? Up to 16 hours sitting throughout the day. People talked about eye aches, migraines, back pains, stomach pains that really got in their way, even if they did show up to class, got in their way of their ability to focus, right? So their work experience really shapes the way that they experience education when enrolled, and the extent to which they're willing to take that risk of enrollment. So work primacy in community life, I found that youth participate in organizations that align with their work goals and economic aspirations, and avoid activities that may expend already limited financial resources. So for Julian, who was a warehouse worker who arrived in the US at 13 from Guatemala, his limited financial flexibility and also his aspirations for economic mobility meant that he committed limited resources to martial arts classes. So rather than going to school, he actually put money, $40 per month, to access a recreational space that allowed him to have physical activity that he missed as a warehouse worker, also learning a new skill, and then being able to convivir, or to just make friends in this recreational space, right? He said, I practice martial arts and have been advancing. Right now we're training with other youth. We motivate each other. I take that back to work. For example, I learned to earn more at work, and I started earning, I think, because of the speed I had with working. So he thought that his flexibility, his stamina, his increased activity because of martial arts actually made him more productive at work. He said, I started earning a bit more, and I earn more now than I did before the classes. So work primacy is evinced in that Julian rationalizes spending $40 and his time in martial arts classes in order to benefit his financial position immediately and in the long term. He engaged in this recreational practice because of the mobility that it promised as a result of his increased pace of work, his coordination, and his stamina. Also, this encouragement that he now had with a community of young people that combated his sense of isolation that comes with being unaccompanied, right? And then this also shows how youth assess the benefits of non-work related activities in light of their economic goals. So at the other side of that is that youth opt out of spaces that may drain their limited financial resources, even at the risk of their health and their well-being. Tomas detailed how wages and work schedules determine youth school going, and also explained that young people's attitudes can be shaped towards health, medical care, self-care, their ability to care for themselves because of the limitations on financial resources. He said, you can go to school if you earn well, you work a few hours and you aren't bien matado, or directly translates to killed, but if you aren't being overworked, then you can go to school, right? If you get sick, you can go to the hospital. But if you have nothing, you earn little, and you work a lot, then no. I'd prefer not to even go to the hospital, aunque me estoy muriendo. Even if I'm dying, the financial cost isn't worth it. So youth are, even in cases of survival, thinking about their next step in terms of financial resources and within the context of their role as workers. So my final point is that work primacy shapes family life and ties that youth have with left behind families that initially motivated their migration. And this is significant because of the physical, emotional costs of losing ties or connections, or reshaping ties and connections because of the thing that you thought would actually make you closer or more stable within your family. But unstable work and wages block youth's ability to meet their living expenses in the US for themselves and provide consistent remittances to families abroad. So I have this case of Lucinda. I know this is a long quote, but I'll read it very briefly. I asked Lucinda about the obstacles of achieving her goals for personal and familial mobility, and she responded with something that sort of caught me off guard, and she cried her way through this part of our interview. She said, because of in the garment industry, there are weeks where you earn well, there are weeks where you don't earn well. When those weeks come, sometimes I have to go to the market. Sometimes there are bills that are separate from rent. You pay the rent and it becomes difficult for me sometimes. I don't have any money left over. Sometimes I tell myself I'm going to send this much to my mom. I call her, I tell her, don't worry, I'm going to send you money on Saturday. It'll be a small amount, but I'm going to send you money for your expenses. So she leaves her mom with a promise that she'll contact her on Saturday with remittances, right? When Lucinda finds that she cannot fulfill her promise to her mom, she chooses not to call her that Saturday, perhaps due to the stigma, the shame, or just not wanting to disappoint her mom or her family. And remember, young people say, I came here to end my mom's suffering. So there's a special attachment that youth have to their mothers or the women that were their caretakers in the home country. So Lucinda continues, then Saturday comes and I don't want to call her and tell her that I don't have enough to make ends meet. Or sometimes I want to buy something and I tell myself I'm going to, but I cannot buy it. So not only Lucinda having trouble supporting herself, but because she's unable to remit money, she actually has to distance herself from her family. And family marginalization or financial marginalization actually causes marginalization within the family, right? And this is important for youth whose family ties are transnational and can reinforce feelings of loneliness, the feelings that come with unaccompaniment in the US. Another young person mentioned that he refuses to call home when he doesn't have money, when he feels physically ill, or when he's emotionally or physically exhausted from work because he doesn't want to worry his family in Guatemala. So there are also cases where youth distance themselves from their family initially, but then as time went by and they gained financial stability, they were able to re-engage with their transnational family ties. So work life, wages, earnings, and stability in the workplace really shapes the way that youth are able to engage with their families. And again, this is really important for unaccompanied young people growing up in the US. So in my study of unaccompanied and undocumented youth and youth workers in Los Angeles specifically, I'm trying to bring into the fold a segment of the population that has been under-considered in research and policy. This study advances labor migration and immigrant incorporation scholarship by considering how youth workers social incorporation is conditioned by the labor institutional context, right? Not all undocumented youth migrants are entering schools and transitioning into adulthood as students, right? But we also have this segment of the population that is coming of age as workers. This research finds that work primacy is a result of the pressures of economic obligations to families, economic obligations to personal individual survival in the US, fused with the distinct force of the conditions of the secondary labor market, right? Those exploitative, low wage conditions of the secondary labor market. So work primacy conditions use social incorporation by shaping their educational trajectories as a way that's distinct from the narrative that we're familiar with of dreamer or documented youth. It conditions community participation in transnational family life. Entering the workplace ultimately results in a qualitatively different social incorporation trajectory, right? Patterns of participation in the local and transnational community, prospects for mobility are shaped by a labor institutional context. And we have to consider that when we think about what's happening with today's unaccompanied minors, right? So what this tells us more broadly, and what I said I mentioned about chapter 5 of the book, is that when we talk about immigrant incorporation, or the markers that signal immigrant incorporation and signal success, deservingness of membership, legal protection, and so forth, we actually have to take into account this whole body of youth that don't have access to the institutions, the schools that mark success, that mark mobility. We have to take into account what spaces youth inhabit more diversely, more broadly. And this becomes increasingly important as we see these high rates of unaccompanied minor migration today, and think about the diverse pathways that children arriving at the border can take as they transition into adulthood in the US and Los Angeles. So I will end there. Thank you.
Professor Canizales, thank you so much for that. At this point, I'd like to invite the audience to enter questions into the Q&A down below on your screen. As people do that, the panel will start us off with some questions. Just give people a chance to type.
Professor Canizales, could you tell us a little bit about the extent to which the experiences of the folks you interviewed were sexed or gendered, right? Especially as it might with regards to sort of their vulnerability or the possibility of them being exploited.
Yeah. So one of the ways that I thought this work primacy was interesting is that because they are minors at arrival, the jobs that they take are the ones that we associate with women, undocumented women in the US. So the garment industry actually had a lot of undocumented, unaccompanied male minor workers. And women and men were both in restaurants or in these other occupations that we consider immigrant jobs. The one way I will say that I saw gender play out was when it came to janitorial domestic work, where women tended to concentrate, which further limited their ability to participate in the community, to participate in educational or adult English language schools later in the day, because they're actually like in-home domestic workers. So work primacy is heightened in those cases. And I think also the times that the schools, adult English language schools are open, right? Like 7:45 to 9:45 p.m. also created some kind of gender limitation on women who were able to go into these public spaces late at night because of the association of what is appropriate and when an appropriate time for women to be out is.
course, age probably factored into that as well, right? In terms of accessing nighttime and
Yes,
yes.
yes.
Professor, can you talk a little bit about whether or not the youth were able to create a sort of substitute family or a community of either like age, same age youth, or from the same country, or an alternative family? How did they support themselves sort of while here?
Yeah, so both of the papers I have out in Ethnic and Racial Studies and the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies talks about these like efforts to build community among unaccompanied, undocumented youth, right? One of the things I found was that one of the first institutions outside of the workplace that youth inhabited was the church, right? Which isn't really surprising. I studied 2 Catholic churches in Pico Union for 2 years and observed youth groups within them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the primary places that youth go, not only for the space, like the reprieve of just having a space that feels safe and protected, but also the youth groups as places where they found similarly situated peers, right? The way that I got to the church youth groups was actually through a support group, an informal support group with unaccompanied, undocumented Mayan youth who said that they initially were going to the church youth groups, but found that a lot of the things they were struggling with weren't being addressed by messages like rely on God, wait on God, pray more, serve more, tithe more. So they ended up developing their own once a week 2-hour meeting where they just answered a simple question, how was your week? And they could talk about anything that they wanted. And that was one of the spaces that I observed the longest for 4.5 years, where I actually observed how young people who didn't really, maybe they knew that there were similarly situated peers, but the extent to which they shared common experiences didn't really come through until those conversations were starting. And I joined the group about 8 months into its inception, so they were still kind of getting a feel for what the group could do, but it ended up being discussions about everything from the workday to families. There were like earthquakes in Central America at the time, cousins or siblings that wanted to migrate and what advice to give them in terms of what life in the US would be like. So they were really supporting each other on a broad spectrum of issues that they were dealing with. I'll also say that there are youth who meet in the workplace and start their own soccer clubs, running clubs, women that go to Zumba classes together, walking groups, like these sorts of things that come out of the time they spend at work, right? And their relegation to the workplace during most of their days.
Great, great, thank you. That gives us a range of those sort of community and social worlds that they're navigating. We have a couple questions, or a few questions on the Q&A from one of our CIS students. Would you argue that the entrance of undocumented youth into American society through a workplace system rather than through the educational system results in isolation, more isolation from people their age?
Yes and no, because there are other people their age also in the workplace. But I think when we think about the way social capital works, social networks work, the strongest social ties, the strongest social networks that we can have are those with people who aren't situated in the same social position we are, right? So I mean, I think about myself, I didn't really know about college until my best friend, whose family had been telling her to go to college in high school, told me about, you know, what I needed to do. And then I ended up on this track that I wouldn't have been on myself, right? So when we think about youth who are embedded in the workplace and surrounded by other undocumented, unaccompanied young people, their ability to get access to opportunities, their ability to meet people that are outside of the experience that they have themselves is limited by the workplace. So I guess the type of people that they're meeting their age is what's being limited as a result of their entry into the workplace.
See, great, thank you. There's another comment. Do you find that there's a language issue among your participants? That is, do they work in places in which they're primarily surrounded by other Spanish speakers, or do they end up predominantly in English-speaking environments? Relatedly, do you find that they're more or less likely to be survivors of the workplace abuse if they are in an English-dominant environment?
Okay, I'm gonna read these questions to myself.
Okay.
Okay, do they work in places in which they're primarily surrounded by other Spanish speakers? So one of the things I found really interesting, one of the things I was initially interested is unaccompanied, undocumented youth legal consciousness, right? Like, to what extent are they aware of their legal status and the limitations posed by their undocumented status? And I found that because of the demographics of the Pico Union, Westlake, or even the workplace demographics where they're undocumented, indigenous and non-indigenous, Central American and Mexican people, again, similarly situated, that there wasn't much discussion about legal status because it seemed like their peers were densely also undocumented, right? So in the case of language, I'm writing a few language papers now, and that's something that goes into my Indigenous youth chapter also. The linguistic communities that they participate in are predominantly Spanish speaking. So for Indigenous Mayan native language speakers, that is one of the initial barriers that they have to overcome, right? Learning Spanish either before migration, in transit, or upon entry into the US. And that's something that can, again, limit the social networks that they have access to, right? In the workplace, it's primarily Spanish-speaking coworkers, and typically, so I guess it varies by occupation. You can imagine a domestic working woman having to interact with an English-speaking homeowner. I have a case of a young woman who at the age of 15 was babysitting 2 kids in West LA, and she actually learned English as the kids were moving through pre-K, kindergarten, and then like from the cartoons that they were watching after school, right? So those sorts of things differ, those sorts of interactions differ from the factory workers who are speaking to a Spanish-speaking floor manager and Spanish-speaking coworkers. Do I find that they're more or less likely to be survivors of workplace abuse in an English-dominant environment? So according to the youth that I interviewed, if it was an American-owned business, they were less likely to feel like they were being discriminated against, or they felt like they were being treated more fairly. I will say though that the Indigenous women that I interviewed often talked about feeling like they were targeted, like sexually targeted or being taken advantage of, or that they were more likely to be ridiculed by Spanish-speaking non-Indigenous people, or the business owner, the factory owner, the store manager, whatever it may be.
Super interesting. Okay, so we have a third question, and because our viewers can't see all the questions, I'll read it aloud, and then you can go ahead and answer it in its, in its pieces. You spoke to the idea of incorporation, and this feels like a very complex and layered idea. What are the goals of incorporation, especially socially and politically? Are there typical cultural sacrifices for this kind of, for inclusion? Can this concept fit around a sense of development as an individual, bringing themselves and their own ideals to a new setting?
So incorporation is something I spend several weeks talking about in my immigration course. I will say this, this idea of incorporation and even integration comes from a revamping, a reworking of this notion of assimilation, right? This idea that the newcomer has to adjust, acculturate, be absorbed into this stagnant mainstream, right? But we know that the introduction of newcomers with old timers results in this new like hybrid cultural social space, right? So the goal, I think, what are the goals of incorporation socially and politically? I think because of this idea that there's nested contexts of reception differ, right? California is very different from Kansas, is very different from Texas, very different from Florida, right? So that makes it so that incorporation socially and politically in California looks different than it does in Texas, right? The goal is different. It's kind of like a moving target. And like I mentioned, Pico Union is its own little bubble of co-ethnic space. So incorporation into Pico Union Latino community is different than incorporation into a broader Los Angeles social and cultural space. So I really think it's about how we're situating the individual or the community within their context. And I know that's a really roundabout way of saying it, but I encourage you to enroll in my, in my immigration course. I'm happy also to share the 2 articles that I have published, especially on unaccompanied immigrant youth incorporation, because I lay out what incorporation could look like for this particular population relative to the undocumented youth or adult workers that we already know about.
Great. So if people are interested, I will get those from the professor and distribute them through our website. Yes. We have a question from somebody in the CIS. Did you work with any participants who had family members who ended up coming to the US? If so, what kinds of tensions did you observe with family members during reunification?
Yeah, so I actually, there were 2 participants that I interviewed who had cousins who migrated post-crisis, post-2014. So it was interesting because on the one hand, because these young people had experienced unaccompanied migration, they were unaccompanied minor migration, they were sympathetic to the newcomer that wanted to migrate, was in transit or had already arrived. So one of the participants had a cousin who left Guatemala, didn't tell him, but then said like, I'm on my way, I'll be there soon. So there was a discussion about someone coming and what am I going to do when they get here type of thing. And then there was another person who had a cousin who did actually make it to Los Angeles. And again, the tension between, I know what the undocumented, unaccompanied minor experience is, so wanting to be sympathetic, but also I can't take on this financial burden. Like, I'm undocumented too, so what does it mean to have another minor in my care? And that sort of conflict, like internal conflict. And the youth would talk to each other within that support group about the children that were coming in 2014 and in the years after, and what they had to do to make sure that their own siblings didn't migrate, that their family members didn't migrate, because aquí uno viene a sufrir, like you come here to suffer. So doing what they can to send more money in remittances, telling parents or tios and tias, like hug them, give them affection, ask them how they're doing so that they don't migrate, because they didn't actually want younger people in their family to also migrate unaccompanied and undocumented.
Great, thank you. I'm going to yoke the last 2 questions together. Did you notice changes in the mental or emotional health of your participants after the election of Trump? And can you speak a little bit to the gentrification of LA, the ways in which employment opportunities might be structured for unaccompanied youth, and are there deterrents in seeking opportunities in these new sort of gentrified businesses and areas?
Okay. Notice a change in the mental and emotional health of my participants after Trump's election. I would say that I guess in this case, I wouldn't say that there was a change in the emotional mental health after Trump's election, but the change that I noticed was after the 2014 humanitarian crisis and the increased attention on unaccompanied minors, because a lot of these young people hadn't thought of themselves as having been unaccompanied minors, right? They thought of themselves as labor migrants, like they worked in their home countries and they migrated. And then hearing the categorization of an unaccompanied young person, seeing what was happening to Central American youth on the border or in transit, or indigenous youth that were disproportionately dying in federal custody, like that did something to change the way that they felt about their own experience. I think also coming from countries where the government isn't necessarily trusted, or the government has persecuted citizens, right? Or persecuted their community, it isn't really that shocking to come into contact with someone like Donald Trump, right? So I think I'll say those two things to that effect. And then I'm curious about whether gentrification has affected the availability of employment opportunities. I would say that from what I could tell, things like restaurant jobs or janitorial jobs actually became more available as I spent more time in the field, because downtown Los Angeles was kind of a bust area, right? There wasn't a lot of activity, economic activity in downtown LA. And those of us who've grown up there know that it's only in recent years that the restaurants, the hotels, and all of these things are opening up. So perhaps more employment opportunities for immigrants broadly and unaccompanied youth. I'll also say, because I focus on, or my population was predominantly garment working youth, the garment industry in Los Angeles is alive and well, and it's not going anywhere. And I know people think that it's other countries that do these horrific acts of manufacturing and exploitation of manufacturing workers, but it's happening, you know, in downtown LA, the fashion industry, the fashion district where I lived for 2.5 years, right? Like, these factories are there. Those signs, you walk through downtown and you will see those signs every day posted on the doors of buildings that you would think are completely abandoned, which only tells you what might be happening inside, right? And then have the unaccompanied youth showed a sense of deterrence from seeking opportunities at these new businesses? I think, again, the necessity, the urgency, the financial need for survival makes it so that youth will look for jobs just about anywhere. The thing about work primacy, though, is that because of the exploitation of the jobs in the secondary labor market, because of the long hours and the low wages, the job jumping, which Jackie Hagan talks about in her book, Skills of the Unskilled, job jumping doesn't actually happen all that often. So if you have a job, that's going to be your job for quite a few years, because you're working from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. So the ability to go out and look for another job doesn't really come too often. So it took quite a few years for someone to take the risk of losing a work day, potentially leaving a job that they know, even if they get paid $90 a week, they were going to get that $90 as opposed to risking maybe making less or not making anything the next week if they chose to leave that job. So I think even as the landscape around them changes, a lot of times work primacy constrains youth's ability to access those opportunities.
Great, Professor, thank you so much. I think we're a little bit over time. Thank you,
Yeah,
that was
sorry.
amazing. It was incredible.
Thank you.
For those of you that are regular watchers, you're going to be able to find the link to this on YouTube, right on the CTSJ website.
We'll also put it out on our social media. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.